My name is Brooke Madison. I am 24 years old, and I am currently standing in the middle of a crowded apartment complex in Chicago with a master's degree in my hand and a heart that feels like it's been put through a paper shredder. Nobody showed up to my graduation today. Not my mother, not my father, and certainly not my older sister, who has spent her entire life stepping on my neck to reach the sunlight. I stood on that stage alone while the stadium speakers barked my name, looking out at a row of empty, cold metal seats that I had paid for with my own sweat and blood. But the real nightmare didn't start until 3 days later, when my phone buzzed with a text message that destroyed whatever tiny shred of family loyalty I had left. My mother didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't congratulate me on becoming a software engineer. She simply demanded $5,100 for my sister Cassandra's upcoming 18-year-old debut party. I looked at that number, $5,100, and I felt something inside me finally snap. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for an explanation. I just sent back exactly $1 with a note that said, "Congrats on being 18, Cassie." And then I immediately called a locksmith to change every single bolt on my front door. I thought that would be the end of it, but just hours later, the rhythmic, heavy pounding of police officers echoed through my hallway, and I realized my mother wasn't just coming for my money anymore. She was coming for my freedom. Before I tell you how I turned the tables on their financial betrayal and watched their golden world crumble, I want to ask you, what time is it where you are right now, and in which city are you watching this? I truly want to know how far my voice is reaching today. If you have ever felt like the black sheep who is only loved for their paycheck, please hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your story, and join our community of survivors. Now, let me take you back to the moment the sirens started. The silence that followed the departure of the locksmith was heavy, filled only by the ticking of the clock on my wall and the haunting memories of a life lived as a second-class citizen. To understand why a mother would weaponize the police against her own daughter over a $5,100 party, you have to look into the cracks of the Madison household, where my sister Cassandra was the golden sun, and I was just the cold shadow she cast. Growing up in the quiet suburbs of Illinois wasn't a fairy tale for me. It was a long, exhausting game of psychological survival where the rules were always rigged in favor of the firstborn. Cassie was born into a world of yes, a child so shielded from reality that she believed the world owed her a standing ovation for simply breathing. Our mother, Beverly Madison, viewed Cassie as a reflection of her own vanity, a beautiful doll, to be dressed in the finest clothes even when our father, Douglas, was struggling to pay the mortgage. I remember being 10 years old and watching Cassie throw a violent tantrum because her birthday cake had the wrong shade of pink frosting, and instead of a reprimand, Beverly spent an extra $50 to buy a second cake, while I sat in the corner with a pair of shoes that had holes in the soles. My father was a man made of wet cardboard, a shadow of a person who would rather let me suffer than face the screeching fury of his wife's disapproval. If I brought home an A+, Beverly would sniff and ask why it wasn't a perfect score. If Cassie managed to pass a remedial math class, the entire family went out for a celebratory dinner at the most expensive steakhouse in town. I was the difficult child because I asked for things like a desk to study on or a coat that actually blocked the Chicago winter, while Cassie was the sweet angel for demanding a convertible she didn't even know how to drive. By the time I turned 16, I was working 30 hours a week at a greasy diner smelling like old fries and floor cleaner, just so I could save up for college applications. My parents didn't offer a single cent, claiming that strong girls like Brooke figure it out, while they secretly funneled their savings into Cassie's pageant dresses and designer handbags. I lived on coffee and ambition, pushing myself through a rigorous computer science program, while my sister spent her days lounging by the pool, complaining about how hard it was to be pretty. I had spent 24 years trying to buy a seat at their table, sending back hundreds of dollars every month from my meager graduate stipend because Beverly would call me crying about emergencies that always seemed to coincide with Cassie's shopping trips. The empty seats at my graduation weren't a mistake. They were a final, deliberate message that my success meant nothing to them if it didn't come with a checkbook attached. The rhythmic, aggressive pounding on my apartment door shattered my reflections and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins. I looked through the peephole to see the distorted navy blue uniforms of two Chicago police officers, their presence a jarring intrusion into the sanctuary I had tried to build for myself. When I opened the door, the cold hallway air rushed in, accompanied by the stern, suspicious gaze of an older man whose name tag read, Officer Miller. Miss Brooke Madison, we received an urgent call regarding a wellness check from your mother, Beverly. She stated that you've been acting erratically, showing signs of severe mental instability, and that you might be a danger to yourself since you abruptly changed your locks and cut off all communication. Miller said, his eyes scanning my apartment over my shoulder. Behind him, a younger officer scanned my living room, looking for signs of a struggle or a breakdown. I felt a surge of nausea, not from fear, but from the sheer breathtaking audacity of a woman who would risk her daughter being arrested or committed just to punish her for a lack of compliance. I am perfectly sane, officer. I am just a woman who decided to stop being a bank for people who didn't bother to show up to my graduation 3 days ago. I replied, my voice as steady as a surgeon's despite the earthquake happening in my chest. I invited them into my home, gesturing toward the framed master's degree sitting on my desk and the professional workstation that hummed with the quiet power of a high-end software project. I opened my phone and showed them the text thread, the blatant demand for $5,100 for a party, followed by my $1 rejection, and then the immediate threat of a wellness check. This isn't a mental health crisis, Officer Miller. This is a collection tactic. My mother is using you as a private goon squad because I didn't fund my sister's Sweet 18. I added, my eyes never leaving his. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly as the officers realized they were being used as pawns in a petty, toxic family drama. Miller let out a long, weary sigh, his shoulders dropping as he closed his notebook. We get these calls more often than you'd think, Miss Madison, but usually people aren't this transparent about it. You're clearly fine. I'll be filing a report stating that this call was a malicious use of emergency services. If she calls again, there will be consequences for her, not you. They left with a polite nod, but as the door clicked shut, the silence they left behind felt different. It was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. My mother had just tried to use the power of the state to strip me of my dignity and my freedom, and in doing so, she had severed the last thread of empathy I had for her. I realized that if she was willing to go this far for a party, there was no limit to what she had already done behind my back. The adrenaline from the police visit kept me awake until the gray Chicago dawn began to bleed through my blinds, fueling a suspicion that sat like lead in my stomach. I sat at my desk and pulled up my comprehensive credit report, a task I had neglected during the frantic final months of my master's program. As the digital document loaded, the numbers on the screen began to blur into a nightmare of financial ruin. Under my name, registered to my parents' suburban address, were 2 high-limit credit cards with Chase and Amex that I had never applied for, both maxed out to their limits. But the true horror was the auto loan of $48,000 debt for a luxury Lexus SUV signed for only 4 months ago with a forged version of my signature that looked disturbingly like my own. I felt the air leave my lungs, my vision tunneling as I realized the scale of the theft. My mother hadn't just been asking for $5,100 for a party. She had been living a life of luxury on my credit for nearly a year, using my rising income potential as her personal gold mine. Every designer bag Cassie carried every dinner out, and that shining car in their driveway, had been bought with my future. I saw a charge for $3,000 at a high-end furniture store in downtown Chicago, a place I had only ever walked past. There was another charge for $1,200 for a VIP spa day on a Tuesday afternoon when I had been working a double shift at the computer lab. The sheer volume of transactions was suffocating. They weren't just stealing money. They were stealing the time I had spent working, the sleep I had lost, and the security I had fought for. I felt a cold, lethal rage replace the shock. I picked up the phone and called Marcus, my senior colleague, and a man who understood the intricacies of digital fraud better than anyone I knew. Marcus, it's Brooke. They didn't just ask for money, they stole my identity. $48,000 in debt, all forged, all sent to their house. I said, my voice cracking with the weight of the betrayal. Marcus was silent for a moment, the gravity of the situation settling between us. Brooke, this is serious felony territory. If you don't report this as identity theft immediately, the banks will hold you liable for every cent. You have to name the perpetrator. You have to name Beverly. He warned, his voice urgent and sharp. I looked at the small framed photo on my desk of me as a child standing 5 paces behind Cassie while my parents doted on her. I realized then that they had never seen me as a daughter. I was an asset to be liquidated, a resource to be consumed, until there was nothing left but a husk. I spent the next 6 hours on the phone with the fraud departments of 3 different banks and the Federal Trade Commission, providing my lease agreements, my payroll records from my internship, and the police report number from the wellness check as proof of harassment. By the time the sun was high in the sky, I had frozen every account and initiated a criminal investigation into the woman who had given me life, only to try and steal it back. The following Monday, the war moved from the digital realm to my professional doorstep, proving that Beverly Madison had no concept of boundaries or shame. I was in the middle of a high-stakes sprint meeting at my tech firm, discussing a critical security patch with Marcus when my desk phone buzzed with a frantic tone from the receptionist. Brooke, there is a woman named Beverly and a younger girl named Cassandra in the lobby. They are causing a massive scene, screaming about you stealing a car and threatening to call the local news if you don't come down this second. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I took a deep breath, adjusted my blazer, and looked at Marcus. It's happening, I whispered. He stood up, his face set in a grim expression of support. I'll go with you. We'll record everything. When the elevator doors opened into the glass-walled lobby, the sound of Beverly's shrill voice was already echoing off the marble floors. She was pointing a manicured finger at our security guard, her face a mask of indignant rage, while Cassie stood behind her clutching a designer purse and looking like a petulant princess. You ungrateful, spiteful little brat! Beverly shrieked the moment she saw me ignoring the stares of my colleagues and the silent judgment of the professional world I had worked so hard to enter. The dealership just called and said the Lexus is being flagged for repossession. They said you reported the loan as fraud. How could you do this to your own sister? Cassie needs that car for her internship. You're trying to destroy her social standing because you're jealous of her beauty. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply pulled a manila folder from under my arm and held it up. Beverly, you used my social security number to take out a $48,000 loan while I was finishing my degree. That is a felony. I said, my voice carrying a lethal clarity that silenced the room. I didn't destroy Cassie's car. You stole my name to buy it. You chose to put her in a car you couldn't afford, with money that wasn't yours. The security guards moved closer, their hands on their radios, but Beverly didn't care. She lunged toward me, her face contorted. I birthed you, I fed you, everything you have is mine by right. She screamed, her spit landing on my blazer. I stood perfectly still, looking at the woman who was supposed to be my protector and seeing only a predator. You have exactly 60 seconds to leave this building, Beverly, or I will have the police arrest you for trespassing and harassment. Marcus is recording every word you say. Every insult you hurl is more evidence for the state's attorney. Cassie let out a loud, performative sob, burying her face in her hands. Brooke, please. Why are you being so mean? It's just a car. You make so much money now. Why do you have to be so greedy? She wailed. I looked at my sister, the person I had shared a childhood with, and saw a stranger who had been raised to believe my life belonged to her. It's not a car, Cassie. It's $48,000 of my credit and my future. You are 18 now. In the real world, you don't get to live like a queen on stolen funds. Security, please escort these trespassers out of the building. And Beverly, the police have already been notified of your presence here. As the guards moved in, Beverly's face transformed from rage to a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She screamed that I was no longer her daughter, a sentiment that felt like a promotion rather than a punishment. 3 days after the scene at my office, I agreed to meet my parents and Cassie at a high-traffic Starbucks in downtown Chicago, a location I chose specifically because the presence of so many witnesses would prevent Beverly from escalating into another physical or screaming tantrum. I arrived early, sitting in a booth that faced the door, my laptop open, and my recording app ready. When they walked in, the family dynamic was on full display. Beverly led the way like a general. Cassie trailed behind with a pout that she thought was charming, and my father Douglas followed like a beaten dog, his eyes never meeting mine. Brooke, honey, let's be reasonable for a second. Douglas started, his voice thin and pleading as they slid into the booth opposite me. Your mother just got a little overexcited. She wanted the best for Cassie's debut, and she figured since you were doing so well at that big tech firm, you wouldn't mind helping the family out. We can fix this quietly. Just call the bank and tell them it was a misunderstanding that you gave her permission. I didn't even blink. I turned the laptop screen toward them, showing the itemized list of every transaction Beverly had made under my name. $500 at a spa, $3,000 for a designer wardrobe, and the $5,100 deposit for the ballroom. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Dad. It was a calculated theft. She used my identity to fund a lifestyle she didn't earn while I was working 2 jobs to avoid debt. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Beverly slammed her hand on the table, causing the couple at the next table to jump. You arrogant little bitch. We raised you, we fed you, you owe us everything. How dare you talk about theft when we spent 18 years of our lives making sure you had a roof over your head? I leaned in, my face inches from hers. You gave me a roof, and then you charged me rent with my own future. I have already turned over the evidence to the state's attorney. I am giving you 24 hours to sell that car, return the clothes, and pay back the deposit to my account, or I am testifying against you in a criminal fraud trial. I am not your bank, and I am not your victim anymore. Douglas looked at Beverly, then at me, the realization finally hitting him that the daughter he had ignored for decades was now the one holding all the power. You'd really put your mother in jail over money? Cassie asked, her voice dripping with fake concern. No, Cassie, I replied, standing up to leave. I'm putting a criminal in jail for identity theft. The fact that she's my mother is just a tragedy she created. 24 hours, not a second more. The night of Cassie's Sweet 18 arrived, and despite my ultimatum, Beverly's pride was too great to admit defeat. She went ahead with the party, likely betting that I wouldn't actually follow through with the police in the middle of a celebration. She wanted the world to see the Madison family in their silver and gold glory, a final act of defiance against the difficult daughter who dared to demand her own life back. I wasn't there to see the ballroom filled with flowers or the tiered cake that cost more than my first 3 months of rent, but Marcus had been monitoring the local social media feeds for me. Around 9 p.m., just as Cassie was being introduced to the crowd in her shimmering silver gown, the music was abruptly cut short. The video from a guest's Instagram story showed the confused murmurs of the crowd as 2 uniformed officers and a man in a sharp suit from the bank's recovery department walked onto the dance floor. They weren't there to celebrate. in front of every high school friend Cassie had ever tried to impress, and every suburban socialite Beverly had lied to the officers served a warrant for the immediate seizure of the luxury SUV parked in the VIP spot out front. The bank representative didn't whisper. He spoke loudly enough for the entire front row to hear that the vehicle was being recovered as part of a felony fraud investigation. The humiliation was absolute. Beverly began to scream, her face turning a deep, ugly purple as she tried to physically block the officers, but her tantrums carried no weight here. Cassie stood frozen in the middle of the floor, the golden child finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. The silver gown she wore suddenly looked cheap and tarnished. The catering staff, fearing they wouldn't be paid, stopped the service immediately, and the glamorous facade of the Madison family collapsed in a matter of minutes. Friends who had been laughing and drinking moments before began to filter out of the room, whispering about fraud and criminals, leaving Cassie and Beverly alone in a sea of half-eaten appetizers and deflating balloons. The party didn't just end. It became a crime scene, a public execution of the reputation Beverly had spent my entire life trying to buy with stolen money. The aftermath of that night was a swift and brutal lesson in the consequences of entitlement. Beverly Madison eventually took a plea deal for identity theft and wire fraud to avoid a lengthy prison sentence resulting in a permanent criminal record. A massive fine that wiped out their remaining savings and 10 years of strict probation that prevents her from ever holding a credit card again. The judge was particularly harsh, noting that her attempt to use the police for a wellness check on her victim was an aggravating factor that showed a complete lack of remorse. My father, Douglas, was forced to take a grueling night shift security job at 60 years old just to keep their house from going into foreclosure, his life of quiet complicity finally catching up to him. He sent me one final email begging for money to help with the legal fees, but I didn't even open it. I hit the delete button without a second thought, knowing that his help had always been a one-way street. And Cassie, the girl who was too fragile to work, had to drop out of her expensive private college and take a job waitressing 40 hours a week at the same greasy diner where I had worked as a teenager. She is finally learning the value of $1, but it's a lesson that came at the cost of her sister's love. Every time she clears a table or scrubs a floor, I hope she remembers the sister who would have given her the world if she had just been asked instead of robbed. My own path was difficult, but clean. I spent the next year working with credit repair specialists to erase the $48,000 in debt from my record, a process that involved dozens of affidavits and sworn testimonies. It was exhausting, but every time I signed a document that reclaimed my name, I felt a piece of my soul return. As for me, I sold my apartment in Chicago and took a senior engineering position in Seattle, putting 2,000 miles of mountain and prairie between myself and the toxic wreckage of my past. I blocked every number, changed my Social Security alerts to the highest level, and finally allowed myself to celebrate my own success in a quiet restaurant overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I sat there with Marcus, a real friend who had stood by me when my own blood tried to drown me, and I realized that the silence wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. I am no longer a source of revenue. I am a person. I learned that the hardest part of walking away isn't the distance you travel, but the guilt you leave behind, and I left none. Thank you for listening to my journey. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that family is not a license to destroy someone. If someone is using your love to ruin your life, they aren't family, they are a predator. Don't be afraid to change the locks. Don't be afraid to call the police, and don't be afraid to walk away from a fire that is only keeping other people warm while it burns you alive. You do not owe your future to the people who tried to steal your past. Please hit that like button if you think I did the right thing, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of people taking their lives back. Your support helps ensure that voices like mine are never silenced again. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let anyone tell you that you owe them your soul just because